Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Lydia Guzman, Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement for Chicanos por la Causa. We're going to take a few moments and wait while others join us in the room. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about Chicanos por la Causa. Chicanos por la Causa was founded by a group of activist students back in 1968. The students were protesting for equal and equality in the education system. Since then, Chicanos por la Causa has grown into several states, and we provide health and human services. We provide different programs. To learn more about Chicanos por la Causa, I invite you to visit our website at cplc.org. I'm also representing LULAC. I am the National Immigration Chair for the League of United Latin American Citizens. LULAC is the nation's oldest and largest membership organization. We advocate for civil rights and civil causes. To learn more about LULAC, I invite you to visit us at lulac.org. That's LULAC.org. And I invite you to become a member. We're very pleased also that Community Conversations is hosting this. Thank you so much, Community Conversations. Community Conversations Project facilitates local nonpartisan gatherings where participants can talk about important issues in a way that strengthens community connections rather than opposition to opinions we don't share. And also, I invite you to follow Community Conversations on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And that's Project 4 America. So it's Project 4 America. So what is tonight all about? Well, we have a short video to tell us a little bit about tonight's discussion. Let's let that roll. Political polarization and disinformation is a growing problem in America, and it specifically impacts the Latino community. And joining us this evening is Jacobo Licona. Jacobo is a disinformation researcher for Equis Institute, a research and experimentation hub identifying new ways to reach and engage Latino voters. Prior to working for Equis, Jacobo led research efforts for 2 presidential campaigns and various campaigns committees. He also provided research and communication support for progressive and Latinx organizations. Jacobo, thank you so much for joining us. We talked a little bit about the disinformation and how it targets the Latino community. Can you please explain to us a little more about that?
Thank you, Lydia and LULAC and Community Conversations. I'm excited to be here to talk about this incredibly important topic that we have seen become increasingly more problematic in our communities. And many of us have seen the problem that disinformation and misinformation is having on our community, specifically the Latino community. We have seen, our family members or friends believing conspiracies about our government or coworkers, refusing to wear a mask or get a vaccine because of information they may believe is true. And so the role disinformation has had is different for all of us. But I think we can agree that we have all experienced or know someone who has had a negative experience because of the role of disinformation. But I think disinformation is just one piece of the problem. It isn't just about disinformation or political propaganda. It's also about uncontested communication and what we call information voids.
Information void, that's an interesting concept. Tell us a little bit more about information void.
Yeah, so information voids, another way that we often describe it is information deserts. Essentially, what we see is that there are too many Latinos who are feeling that they're left out of mainstream American society and politics. And part of this is because we do not have as much information to get accurate and fact-based information. So we feel like we are ill-equipped or unentitled to engage in politics or democracy. And oftentimes we don't think politics are relevant, or we feel neglected by our political parties, and we feel like we're not getting the full story from the mainstream media. So this often leads to lower rates of participation in activities that are critical to our own communities and to our community's power, to our community's well-being. And one way that we can bridge this divide is for Latinos to see a politicized Latino identity reflected back to them in our media, in our culture, in our entertainment. And a couple entities that have done this very well is Univision and Telemundo. They are, mainstream media in Spanish or in English that often have played this role for many of us Latinos, but there's a broader set of less traditional Latino audiences, often younger Latino audiences, who are without media that kind of helps them make sense of new developments in this kind of uncertain and changing world. And so as a result, many Latinos are becoming more vulnerable to disinformation efforts. So I think, again, this isn't necessarily just about disinformation and propaganda, but also about this uncontested communication or information voids in our media ecosystems that bad actors are often exploiting and are using this to kind of shape news events, often spreading, again, the disinformation or the false or misleading information. And the problem is that because we do not have enough spaces where we can consume this accurate and fact-based information, especially in Spanish, what we see is, again, these information voids in Latino and Hispanic news, often Spanish language news, being exploited and easily filled with false or deceptive narratives.
Jacobo, you bring up some important points, and we were recently talking to some people in the community, and they have some questions. Let's hear from them.
My question is what's the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation? Aren't they essentially the same thing? If not, elaborate.
He brings up a good point. Even I was confused between the difference of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. What is the difference?
That's a great question. I think it's correct that disinformation and all these other words are words that, get tossed around a lot for many people, and it can be, abstract and intimidating at times as well. So I think it's crucial to kind of understand the difference between specifically disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is false information that is spread with the intent to deceive people or the intent to kind of obscure the truth. So an example of that is maybe we heard about, foreign actors in previous elections trying to interfere in our elections and spread information about how to vote, for example. And they are intentionally doing this to try to, confuse us. But misinformation is more false information that is spread in error. So for example, in our family WhatsApp group chat, if, an aunt sends a link with some false information, but she may not be aware if it's true or false, and she's sharing it more broadly, that's the kind of the difference between the two is the intent. So, disinformation can be pushed by governments, political parties, commercial interests, maybe even individuals who are kind of have different motivations, from whether it's politics or ideology to even at times profit from spreading false information. While misinformation, again, is more rumors and hearsay that people might share with each other without really knowing that the information they're sharing is false.
And what about malinformation?
Yeah, so malinformation is a subset of disinformation. It's really information that is used out of context and intentionally harmful. So there's still intent when it comes to malinformation, but it's often about, using out of context videos or images to try to promote a specific narrative. So for example, in past elections, we've seen altered videos or out of context photos of ICE agents arresting Latinos at the polls. These were not accurate photos. These were photos that also were not necessarily people voting in elections. And so they use these photos to promote a certain narrative. But again, the difference here is that malinformation, they're using out of context images or videos or text to try to promote a specific narrative that, is intended to be false or misleading people. And another example of this would be, currently right now with Russia invading Ukraine, we saw many videos that were from many years ago that they were promoting now as if they were happening today, to try to promote this narrative that, maybe Russia is not to blame for the invasion, and trying to kind of control the narrative by using altered videos and images.
So let's look at other questions from the community.
Who's responsible for the spread of disinformation here in the US, and why are they doing that?
Good question. Jacobo, who is responsible for the spread of this information?
It's a great question, and it's a complicated answer. I think there are many people who are responsible for this. Oftentimes, we see foreign actors who are spreading misinformation or disinformation in order to, influence elections or influence people to vote a specific way. So an example of this is, for example, Russian state officials have often spread disinformation in past elections to try to promote people to vote a certain way. Oftentimes it's trying to confuse people about how to vote, for example. But when it comes specifically to the Latino community, I think what we often see is that disinformation has no borders. We often see disinformation coming from Latin America, for example. And it's not necessarily bad actors in Latin America. There's definitely bad actors spreading disinformation in Latin America, but there's also, family and friends who are spreading, as we kind of talked about earlier, the difference between disinformation and misinformation, who are just unintentionally spreading false information to their family and friends abroad, and vice versa. So there's a lot of different actors at play, some who you could describe as bad actors, while others are not harmful actors, but rather unintentionally spreading false information, like families and friends. But I think the reason why they're doing this is also kind of, there's different reasons why people are promoting this. And so part of this is that some are just profiteers. They're just people trying to make money. They don't really care what they're spreading, and they know that oftentimes disinformation is very what we call like clickbait, and oftentimes people are wanting to consume that type of information either because it's engaging, it's entertaining, and so people are promoting this type of content to make money. Mm-hmm. Others are doing it to inflame tensions or create divisions. For example, we saw a lot of misinformation and disinformation being spread around the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, a couple of years ago, and a lot of that was kind of more this racial tension and racial division to try to create divisions between many communities, oftentimes between the Latino community and the Black community. Others is also to maybe discredit a specific group of people or political party. And like I said earlier, oftentimes as well is to try to influence elections, to try to create confusion among our communities, to maybe make us vote a certain way, or to create so much confusion and distrust in our institutions that we then decide maybe to not vote at all.
She brings up a really good point, but how are we going to combat that?
That's a great question. And I think combating disinformation is becoming a thing that we need to try to become more proactive about, especially in our community. I think there are many different ways that we can do this. And one way that is very important, especially with the Latino community, is to prioritize engaging our community. We need to make sure that whether it's Latino community organizations, local organizations, to be reaching out to our communities, to be building trust with our communities. Because one thing that we are seeing with this information is that it's often tied with kind of distrust towards the media, the government, institutions. And so we need to kind of rebuild that trust. And part of doing that is really, reaching and engaging our communities. Another way is to build out the local media. Especially in Latino and Spanish language spaces, we do not have as many places to go to consume our news and information. And there are many, Spanish language newspapers, local newspapers that could definitely use more support and more resources to reach and engage our communities and to make sure that we are spreading accurate and fact-based information. Again, another option is also having more fact checkers, having more people to be able to promote this accurate content, especially during these times where maybe a lot of disinformation is spreading. So for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic or during elections, we see a lot more disinformation circulating. And during those times, we need more resources or more accurate fact-based information to reach our community in order for us to be able to decipher what's true and false.
We have more questions from the community. Let's hear another one.
What do I do when my crazy aunt or uncle shows me something from social media that I know isn't true?
That's a good point. We've all received, whether it's an email or a messenger message with either a link or just, misinformation. And sometimes, whether it's, coming from a relative or an uncle, and it could be a joke, but those have some serious implications, don't they, Jacobo?
Yes, definitely. I think disinformation and maybe conspiracies, sometimes you can see them as, fun to look at, but there definitely is very real world implications from disinformation and conspiracy theories. We've seen it with the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, with, people getting seriously ill, even leading to death from COVID vaccine disinformation. We also saw it, after the 2020 election with January 6th leading to violence in our capital. So there's violence that can happen from disinformation. There's people can get sick from health disinformation. So there's real world implications. But then even within our community, maybe not as severe as that, but having more problems with personal and family communication. There's many times where, you hear stories of families not interacting with each other anymore because of certain beliefs that one member has. And oftentimes these beliefs are related to disinformation or false information. But I think going back to his question about what do we do when our family members or friends are sharing misinformation with us, or how do we interact with them? I think it's very important, because one thing that we see from disinformation actors is that they want to create conflict. So one thing that we should do is not create conflict, not try to, create arguments with our family members from this, but rather try to have certain steps that we can take. So I think one thing that we can do is to try to verify if that content is misleading or false before we even, start engaging with this family member or friend. And we can do this with many different ways. One way is by, using Google and searching to see what kind of information around that topic there is. Also searching for fact checks. Often with the viral narratives that happen, or these viral conspiracies, there's often fact checks that are associated with them that kind of explain what the narrative is, can tell you a little bit about why it's false, and provide, more accurate information about that narrative that is more credible. In addition to that, oftentimes what we should do is also consider the perspective of the person who shared the story. Again, not trying to create conflict, but trying to understand maybe why they got to that opinion or why they believe that information, and not and avoid escalation, essentially. So instead of telling them that they're wrong, sharing these fact checks, sharing potential articles that maybe you found that maybe share the opposite opinion or the accurate information, and direct people to accurate sources. So, sources that are by, credible organizations, local media, and trying to kind of explain the situation in a way that is more accurate without, avoiding this conflict. But at times, there's also times where you have to decide if it makes sense to comment or not to comment. We see now so many times on Facebook where on, your own personal newsfeed where the comments are even more engaging than the actual posts, people fighting back and forth on comments. And if it's going to lead to conflict, it's better at times maybe not to comment, or to do it in private. If someone's posting something that is false, don't engage in public and try to, humiliate this person for sharing something that is false, but rather maybe send them a private message and share, what you think about this narrative, rather than, trying to escalate the problem.
And I think that's important, especially when you're talking to family and family members. And I've always said this, I've said to my uncle in Espanol, verifica la fuente. That means verify the source. Verifica la fuente. That's very important. And I'm so glad that we're discussing this, Jacobo. So we do have more questions, and let's hear from a few more.
Is this problem that much different in Spanish than in English?
Wow, well, that's an important question. Is this problem more important in Spanish than in English? And that's one thing that I've often asked myself, because I see a lot in Spanish, and I see a lot, with the questions that come up. Jacobo, what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I think oftentimes we kind of have these conversations within our organization as well. Is it worse in Spanish than it is in English? Is the problem more problematic in Spanish? And I think part of the reason why I believe it is more problematic isn't necessarily because the disinformation is worse. The disinformation is often very similar to what is spreading in English. There was disinformation about COVID vaccines spreading in both English and Spanish. But I think it kind of goes back to a little bit about what I spoke about earlier around these information voids. The difference is that in English, oftentimes they're getting fact checked more than in Spanish, or there's resources with more accurate information in English than in Spanish. And so there's more efforts to combat it or debunk the disinformation when it's in English than it is in Spanish. Another big problem here is that a lot of the disinformation we see is spreading on social media. And the social media platforms themselves, they have not been moderating Spanish content the same way that they moderate English content. And so oftentimes when you see a false post in English, they will include a label over the post that says, this is false information, this is misleading information, and then include a resource to a fact check providing the accurate information. This also happens in Spanish, but not at the same rate. And so oftentimes we see a post in Spanish with the identical post or almost very similar post in English. The English post has a label, but the Spanish post does not. And so these are type of things where if there was more resources to moderate Spanish content, there would be more, more symmetries between the English and Spanish posts, and then there would be more resources as well to fact check this content. And so I think part of the problem with Spanish disinformation, again, isn't necessarily that the content is worse, but rather that the resources to combat it are not as readily available as in English.
And I think that's really important. And I think it's also important for the leaders and the advocacy groups to start holding the information sources accountable, both the Spanish media and also some of our leaders, with ensuring that we have accurate and correct information. So let's hear from another question.
What are trusted sources that I can go to check if something's real?
Wow, that's an important question. What are the trusted sources? And when I mentioned earlier, I've asked my uncle to verify the source of information. Where can I refer him to? What are the trusted sources, Jacobo?
That's a great question. And I think when it comes to trusted sources, we often see that in English, there's a wide variety of where you can consume information, and including in Spanish. A lot of Spanish speakers are relying on social media for their information. And it's not necessarily that social media, all the content on social media is bad, but there's ways to maybe verify if this content is accurate. And one thing that we can do is using Google. Even just, Googling what you're looking at, oftentimes and then adding the word fact check, oftentimes you'll find fact checks from credible sources that are providing more details about the news or about a potential disinformation narrative that are providing more accurate information. But beyond fact checks, I think what we really need to rely on is our local media, but also local organizations, our local governments. So websites that oftentimes end in .gov or .org are organizations that have more credible information. So for example, on COVID disinformation, the CDC has information there that provides maybe more accurate information, but also resources to take you to other areas that are maybe more localized. So I think relying on fact checks, relying on local media, even if it's local TV, local news, any of that information is oftentimes much more accurate than the information that you're consuming on social media.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important, because if you're watching this program, chances are you might be bilingual, and you probably will be able to do some research and share those trusted sources of information with the people that are sharing misinformation with you. And I think this is our duty, all of us as a community. So thank you for that, Jacobo. And it's important for all of us to verify information. But also, there are some pitfalls. What are some of the things we should avoid? Because as we know, not everything on the internet is a trusted source. Where should we avoid?
That's a great question. And I think when it comes to trying to avoid certain sources, one thing that you should note on, especially when you are consuming information on social media, is where the content is coming from. So if the content is coming from outside of the United States, oftentimes many of these sources are foreign state-controlled outlets. So news controlled by foreign governments that don't have the same freedom of speech and, freedom of journalists to be able to share the news, and they're controlled by the government. So for example, in Russia, there are many state-controlled news outlets that go far beyond Russia, and they have actually a large influence in the United States, in Latin America, and to Spanish language speakers. There's one, for example, RT in Espanol, which stands for Russia Today. They are across the globe, and oftentimes it looks like they're sharing accurate information. They're sharing, information that's happening day to day. But then when it comes to certain news conflicts or certain major stories like the Russia-Ukraine war, like elections, or when there's ever conflicts around the world, that's when they tend to jump in and spread some of this more disinformation, problematic content, misleading information. And so sources that are controlled by the governments are definitely media that is controlled by the government are sources that you're going to want to avoid. But I think because so much of us are consuming information on social media, one other thing that may not necessarily be specific to sources that you should think about is the type of content that you're consuming when it comes to disinformation. So disinformation often plays at emotions, certain feelings that you may have when you're reading content. Oftentimes rely on your gut. You oftentimes see something and you think, is this true or false? And you almost kind of already know, you're not really sure if it's true or false. And so for when it comes to that, that's always something that you want to double check your sources, verify the source, or verify if you can get further information about that topic. Because oftentimes these topics that create conflict, create emotion, or that are heavily charged with certain tensions are often the type of content that you want to double check to see if it's accurate and fact-based information.
So this is really important, and my takeaway from having this conversation is to verify, but with trusted sources of information. And I'm going to say this in Spanish: verifique, pero con fuentes que son confiables, with trusted sources of information. So thank you for that, Jacobo. Thank you.
And I would quickly just add as well that oftentimes when we are trying to verify these searches or verifying these sources, one thing that you can do is, especially on sites that you are already on that aren't on social media, is check to see their about page. Who are the people behind these pages? Are they credible local news outlets, or is it a source that perceives to be media, but it's actually not even a media organization? Another thing to do is, like I said earlier, is searching whatever you're searching for with the term fact check, or with true, false, hoax, conspiracy, like adding those search terms on Google when you're searching for content. Oftentimes you'll be surprised, but you'll see, many fact checks or more credible information pop up about that content, and will get you more information about, what you need to know and what kind of information you should be, potentially providing to family and friends if you're trying to verify for others as well.
Wow, amazing. Thank you for that. Jacobo, I do have a question though. Many in our Latino community use platforms like WhatsApp or YouTube to receive information. So that is their source of information. Can you tell us if there are bad actors also in those platforms?
That's a great question. And the short answer is yes. We often see bad actors sharing disinformation across these platforms, and oftentimes in a coordinated way, where they share the same information across all the platforms. They share it on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. TikTok is becoming a more emerging platform, especially for young individuals, where a lot of misinformation, disinformation, misleading content is spreading. And kind of going back to what you mentioned, many Latinos are consuming their news and information, not just to interact with friends, but to actually consume news and information on social media. We see that Latinos are actually spending more time on YouTube than non-Latino adults, oftentimes spending twice as much time as non-Latino adults. And YouTube is a place where there's so much information coming at you. There's so many videos in English and Spanish, some short, some long, and people are often relying on sources there on a daily basis to get their information. And one thing about YouTube and even Facebook, for example, is that a lot of the information that you see spreading on YouTube and Facebook actually then starts spreading into other places like WhatsApp. And so oftentimes, we have our family and friend group chats on WhatsApp, but a lot of the information that we are sharing there are links to YouTube, Facebook videos, YouTube videos that are actually spreading, problematic content. So WhatsApp is a place where we can engage with our communities, engage with our family and friends, and actually share, accurate information. But it's also a place that we just need to be aware that oftentimes a lot of false information is spreading on WhatsApp as well. And one of the issues with WhatsApp is that it oftentimes is with people that we know. It's more of like a text messaging type service, but via WhatsApp, where you are engaging with your friends and family. And oftentimes when you get information from friends and family, you tend to believe it more. It's more trustworthy because it's coming from someone that you know. But it's actually, links coming from YouTube and Facebook. And even going back to YouTube for a second, one thing to note is that there's so much information on YouTube, and there's also a lot of good information on YouTube. We were talking earlier about, local news sources, media outlets. Many of these entities and organizations are on YouTube, and you can consume their information as well on these sources. So you don't have to just consume, local news on a website or on TV. You can also consume it on YouTube. But I think part of it as well is that Spanish language information on these platforms is not moderated in the same way as in English. So we just have to be very careful when we're consuming information on social media about what we are consuming. And like we talked about earlier, verify our sources and check to see if we can get more information by fact checking, seeing if there's accurate information somewhere else for us to be able to, get some more details about what we are consuming on these platforms.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And thank you for that, Jacobo. I mean, I can't stress this enough. We need to verify this information, especially before we share it. Verify that it's actual, that it's factual, that it's been researched and it's been fact checked, especially in our community. And I'm going to repeat this in Spanish. Es importante que verifique esta información, que la información esté bien, que la esté todo verificado, porque es muy importante que nomás comparta información que sea correcta y actual. So thank you for that, Jacobo. I so appreciate this conversation. So this is great conversation. If we can remember one thing about this conversation, Jacobo, what would you want the community to take away from this conversation?
That's a great question. And I think the most important thing is that we need to, pause before we share anything, before we consume anything, and learn to be a little bit skeptical about what we are consuming, especially as we talked about when we're consuming so much information on social media. We need to do our research. We need to check our sources, the dates, search for a fact check, rely on official and credible sources. But also when we're not looking at news, any content that, we see and share online, it could carry false information. So just being aware that we are in an ecosystem where so much information is spreading that oftentimes the information that we're seeing is false, it's misleading. But we do have the power to stop it, and we can pause before we share to make sure we're not spreading false information. Oftentimes, like I said earlier, we need to watch out for the, emotion in fake news, the kind of like dramatic or the, woe factor when you're like consuming information. Oftentimes, the disinformation is things that are exaggerating, that are creating conflict, creating emotion, using words like terrible, the worst, or shocking, adding drama into our ecosystem. That type of content is oftentimes where misleading information, disinformation is spreading. And so again, just pausing before you share and being skeptical, and then also doing your own research to verify your source.
Jacobo, thank you for joining us in this conversation. This was so important and a necessary conversation to have. I'm hoping that we can share this information and share accurate information. And I think that's what this is about. I'd like to thank Community Conversations for hosting us and allowing us the space to have this conversation. You can learn more about Community Conversations by visiting the website. The links are listed on the description. You can visit Community Conversations, LULAC, and Chicanos por la Causa, CPLC.org. Thank you so much.